Picture this. It's 1967, the so-called Summer of Love. But you're not turning on with the hippies in San Francisco. No, you're stuck in Boston, Massachusetts for the long, hot summer. A summer of riots and civil unrest. You're sweltering on Route 1. But at least Boston has good radio stations. Maybe if you turn on the radio today, you'll hear something better than the bad news constantly seeping out from Vietnam. Maybe you'll hear something better than Sergeant Pepper for the millionth time. Will today be the day? Maybe. You turn the dial and you're in luck. A slow drum beat creeps in, accompanied by cymbals that sound like rattling prison chains. A grim voice intones, "I'm a loner with problems." And then a surf guitar sleepily sweeps over the voice. You listen as the voice details a series of murders and sexual assaults. As the song comes to its conclusion, you hear him say, "And they call me the Strangler. Strangler in the night. Strangler in the night." The song's over. It was just under 2 minutes long. What did I just listen to? So unlike anything else on the radio in 1967. What you just heard was a debut single from serial killer Albert DeSalvo, the notorious Boston Strangler. I'm your host, Dr. Vitka, Mike Vitka from Spellbound Tours in Salem, Massachusetts. And on this episode of Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore, on this fun-sized episode, we're going to be exploring the strangest record in my collection, 1967's Strangler in the Night by Albert DeSalvo, backed by a song about Albert DeSalvo by a band called The Bugs. Join us, won't you? In the early 1960s, Boston and the surrounding area was rocked by a series of brutal murders. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were found dead in their homes. Most of them were elderly. Most of them had been sexually assaulted, and all of them had been strangled to death. The crime scenes were arranged in such a fashion that when they were discovered, the bodies were splayed out obscenely, grotesquely mocking the people who'd come to clean up the crime scenes. It was a disgusting scene. The victims had all been strangled. Most of them had been strangled with their own stockings. They'd been strangled so hard that the stockings cut deep into their neck and their flesh folded around the stockings. It was hard to remove the stockings from the neck. The media dubbed the killer the Phantom Strangler or the Silk Stocking Murderer. The Boston Strangler had arrived. The police and the news media promoted the narrative that there was one killer at large in Boston. But the truth is, there may have been multiple maniacs at work. You see, most serial killers tend to stick to one demographic. They have one victim profile. They'll kill people of the same race, the same age, and the same social status again and again and again. But the Boston Strangler's victims were all over the map. Most of them were elderly white women, but there were some younger women, and there was at least one black woman among his body count. So it stands to reason there may have been more than one Boston Strangler. Boston was gripped in fear. People were terrified the Strangler would strike again. People locked their old grannies up at home and told their daughters to stay in bed. The Boston Strangler was on the loose. Sales of guns went through the roof. Knives sold out once the guns were gone. And every pet store in pound reported that every guard dog had been adopted as soon as the Strangler story broke. The Strangler was running free, and he had to be stopped. There were more suspects than the Boston police and the Strangler Bureau could handle. They rounded up all the usual suspects, but all the perverts and murderers had stone-cold alibis for their whereabouts when the Strangler murders went down. The police even called in self-proclaimed psychic Peter Herkos to try to track down the Strangler. Not that That helped much. And on top of this, there were all the crank calls and false confessions. The Boston police had their hands full on this case. Just when the Boston police thought they'd never crack the case, Albert DeSalvo came on the scene. Albert DeSalvo was a lifelong creep. He'd been molesting people since practically the day he was born, with perfect slick back greasy hair, droopy eyes, and a whiny Boston accent. DeSalvo was prowling the streets of Boston as the Measuring Man. DeSalvo would knock on a lady's door, and when she answered, he'd lie to her and say he worked for a modeling agency, and he was looking to give a contract to women who had good physical measurements. Amazingly, the Measuring Man ruse sometimes actually worked. Once DeSalvo got into the house, he would take out his measuring tape. He'd start measuring his victims. The measuring would devolve into what the press dubbed rough groping, and sometimes full-on rape. DeSalvo also pulled a much more reasonable version of the home invasion scam. He would dress in green coveralls and pretend to be a maintenance man hired by the superintendent to inspect the homes. That almost always worked. DeSalvo was able to gain entrance and find new victims. DeSalvo was caught in the act again. This time he'd gone so far as to disguise himself as a detective to gain access to his victim's home. He was caught, and he admitted everything. It looked like it was going to be an open and shut case. Nobody suspected that DeSalvo was the silk-stocking murderer. Victims came forward after recognizing his photograph to finger him as their sexual assailant. DeSalvo was going to be put away a long time for his home invasion, rapes, and attempted rapes. But then things got weird. DeSalvo started telling everyone who'd listen that he was, in fact, the Boston Strangler. DeSalvo had never even been suspected of committing the Boston Strangler slayings. But soon he started telling everyone that he really was responsible for those grisly murders. Under hypnosis, DeSalvo revealed facts from the case that had remained hidden from the public. It seemed like maybe he was telling the truth. However, some people in power doubted him. There were those who said he was merely repeating stories told to him by his cellmate, another murderer and rapist named George Nassar. It seems very likely, looking at it with hindsight, that Nassar might have been the real Strangler. It's entirely possible that DeSalvo had simply been repeating Nassar's stories, claiming himself as the protagonist so that he could take credit for the Strangler crimes. Nassar didn't want to be convicted. He wanted a chance to get out and kill again. DeSalvo knew he was going up the river and he wanted the attention. So it makes a lot of sense that he would be willing to get the publicity and take the rap for Nassar. The head of the Bridgewater State Insane Asylum went so far as to say that DeSalvo was a serial confessor, and he just wanted the attention. Since there was no physical evidence linking DeSalvo to the crimes, and the only evidence anyone had was DeSalvo's shaky confession, he was not tried for the Boston Strangler murders. He was simply tried for his long collection of rapes and other sexual assaults. He was convicted of those and sentenced to life in prison. While he was convicted for his sexual crimes, everybody knows what he was really being sentenced for were the Boston Strangler murders. Eventually, in 2013, DNA evidence did link DeSalvo to at least one of the Strangler crime scenes, but at the time, nobody knew how much of the truth he was telling, if he was telling any of the truth at all. In the end, DeSalvo got his wish. In the minds of the American public, now and forever, DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. After an escape attempt and rearrest, DeSalvo was eventually murdered in 1974. But not before he released a novelty record, a 45, called Strangler in the Night. Luckily for DeSalvo, He was killing people before the Son of Sam laws made it illegal for criminals to profit off their crimes. DeSalvo was riding high on the notoriety of being the Boston Strangler. There was no physical evidence to convict him of the crimes, but in the minds of the people, he was the Boston Strangler. He finally had an audience. He'd been a nobody all his life, and finally, people were listening to this greasy little weasel and wanted to hear his story. The problem was, the state wasn't giving him much of a chance to talk. They kept him locked up tight and didn't want anybody to hear what he had to say. They only let a few reporters in to talk to him. One reporter who was granted an audience with DeSalvo was Dick Levitin from WEEI Sports Talk Radio. Over the course of his interviews, Dick got DeSalvo to spill the Boston beans on everything. He described his thoughts, feelings, and emotions. He told how he had done wrong without thinking, and how he'd become a human machine incapable of controlling his lust and murderous rage. With the help of a ghostwriter, Levitin stitched DeSalvo's ramblings into a poem. In the poem, the DeSalvo character starts out sympathetic, but by the end of it has devolved into an incel. Miserable, not willing to take responsibility for his murders and his rage against women. The poem was creepy. Levitin took it to Astor Records in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Astor Records paid Levitin for the rights to the poem. They recorded a creepy voice narrating the story. Astor brought in an exciting local garage band, The Bugs, to record music to set the scene. They settled on a spooky surf rock groove. The groove was plugged in behind the voice, and it seemed like a hit single was about to be born. Levitin was paid for his trouble, and DeSalvo apparently signed off on it. DeSalvo got paid for his part in the creation of the song, too. By some sources, though, he may have only been paid $50. The record was released to great fanfare. Serious-looking sleeves were printed up. The top had a quote from DeSalvo and a replica of his signature. Playing on the success of Frank Sinatra's recent hit, Strangers in the Night, the record was titled Strangler in the Night. The A-side played it straight. DeSalvo was credited as the artist, and despite the fun music behind the narration, the track was serious. The B-side was another story. It was the Bugs again, with a swinging number called Albert, Albert, a dance song about Albert DeSalvo, which had such classic lyrics as, Albert, Albert, what the heck? You're just a pain in the neck. Albert, Albert is great. If it had been released just a few years earlier, I think that instead of doing the twist, kids around the country would have been dancing to the Strangler. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Strangler in the Night and Albert, Albert was a flop. To DeSalvo's great disappointment, the record was a failure. It was released to great fanfare, but unfortunately, few people heard it. And those that do were outraged that profit was being made off of such a grisly series of murders. The record faded into obscurity. It still pops up on eBay from time to time, and you may find it hidden in the back of New England record stores. But on the whole, outside of true crime junkies and Boston music historians, Albert, Albert and Strangler in the Night remains just as mysterious as the true identity of the Boston Strangler. In just a moment, we're going to play for you both sides of the infamous Boston Strangler record. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Even if you didn't, make sure you like and subscribe and tell all your friends that they should be watching Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore. Although I have to warn you, after listening to Albert, Albert, you won't be able to get that song out of your head until you're in your own grave.
night may be warm, or it may be cold. I'm a man who needs someone, a woman to hold. I'm a loner with problems, many so small, but small problems in millions is no living ball. I need someone to cling to help me to bear these troubles and heartaches with tease, drive, and dare. I don't know a woman, and yet I crave on. My mind tells my body, don't stand there, get one. Then all of a sudden, I'm no longer clean. I'm a massive wild muscle, a human machine. My body is reckless, my mind unaware. In these moments of madness, I fight, claw, and tear. And then all is quiet, and I'm me again. I've done wrong without knowing, and caused so much pain. At last I am captured, no longer to roam. The state penitentiary will now be my home. And the worst thing that happens here in the clink is that you go out of your mind as you start to think. My mind's in a frenzy, my body in flight. And so now I've been labeled Strangler in the night. Strangler in the night. Strangler. The night may be warm, or it may be cold. I'm a man who needs someone, a woman to hold. I'm a loner with problems, many so small, but small problems in millions is no living ball.
Levitin. Levitt in.
Let it in. Dick, let it in.